In the deep privacy of a secured room within Buckingham Palace, King Charles affixed his name to a clause destined to reshape the royal institution for generations. This classified decree went far beyond merely recognizing Catherine's impending significance. It explicitly designated her as the foundational matriarch who would guide the monarchy forward alongside William, while simultaneously dismantling Camilla's enduring role within the crown's long-term administrative framework. As Charles lifted his pen from the parchment, the atmosphere remained heavy with solemnity. Those present recognized that anchoring one future path for the throne demanded the deliberate winding down of another. His personal secretary stood motionless, and the constitutional specialist remained poised in the quiet air. The sovereign had validated the Crown Continuity Instrument, a highly restricted protocol blueprinting how sovereign power, court administration, ritual protocol, and national representation would transition into the subsequent era. This was not an act of abdication. The king had not relinquished his sovereignty or handed immediate governance to William and Catherine. Nevertheless, the ramifications were monumental. It solidified Catherine's path as the future queen consort and excluded Camilla from all subsequent lineage strategies, inner policy councils, and enduring crown duties. Gazing once more at Camilla's written identity, the monarch pressed his thumb to the document. He quietly inquired if an alternative path existed. The legal expert responded with absolute clarity, explaining that any hesitation would fracture the royal house into competing factions of power. William required absolute certainty, just as Catherine needed the autonomy to prepare. Camilla, conversely, would be stripped of the ultimate status she believed decades of devotion had secured. Charles braced himself, realizing this decree shielded his son and daughter-in-law while deeply wounding the partner who had walked beside him through public banishment and ultimate redemption. The authority of the decree was further reinforced by a classified addendum, a restricted component affixed to the primary text containing sensitive directives omitted from public eyes. This specific segment transferred direct stewardship of long-term vision, charitable portfolios, youth initiatives, and modernization of ritual to Catherine. Her voice would shape how the upcoming court communicated, functioned, and engaged with society. Additionally, a secondary provision barred Camilla's inner circle and bloodline from holding authority once Charles's time on the throne concluded, dissolving an alliance structure previously expected to outlast the transition. Moments later, a royal courier gathered 2 secure packets and moved through the palace galleries. One envelope traveled toward Adelaide Cottage, delivering a massive mantle of obligation and historical weight to William and Catherine. The other was carried toward Clarence House, bearing undeniable confirmation for Camilla that her future standing had been brought to an end by the very partner she relied upon. Yet, before either woman could fully absorb the king's actions, the emergence of the document forced the royal household to confront hidden devotions, deep-seated grievances, and clashing perspectives masked behind their polished external images. For Catherine, the document brought forth a future she had spent over a decade readying herself to fulfill, though she had never presumed to claim it prematurely. For Camilla, the reality was far more severe. The cold realization that historical forces were moving past her while she still resided within the palace walls. 2 female figures from different eras, bearing distinct reputations and royal mandates, suddenly found their fates tied to a single text. One was being propelled toward the center of power, while the other was being systematically detached from its future. When Catherine broke the seal alongside William at Adelaide Cottage, the opening lines caused her to pause entirely. Her public standing had been earned through discipline, measured restraint, domestic stability, and years of maintaining public trust. Never viewing the role of queen as a prize to be captured, she perceived it as an immense obligation demanding profound compromises from her marriage, her offspring, and her personal sanctuary. Consequently, the text outlining her role as the paramount female pillar of the coming era brought no joy. The Crown Continuity Instrument, the classified roadmap for passing royal sovereignty onward, placed immense power within her grasp, while decisively shutting out Camilla's future path. William observed her reading the passage multiple times before she rested the documents on the table. Moving away into the quiet room, Catherine softly remarked that a deep wound was about to be inflicted on someone. The prince stepped closer, weighing his words with immense care. He emphasized that this decree was never intended as an award, but rather as an essential shield for the crown, their heirs, and a future court that could not withstand fractured allegiances. Turning back to face him with visible distress, she noted that institutional protection offers little comfort when it is carved directly out of another person's erasure. He acknowledged her perspective completely, fully aware that her elevation arrived at the direct cost of another woman's position. The heir to the throne then shared a piece of information he had previously withheld. Charles had privately sought his counsel weeks prior during an officially archived palace dialogue preserved for the lineage files. Though William had not drafted the text, he had explicitly signaled to his father that the upcoming court could not function effectively under two clashing centers of female influence. Catherine looked at him, recognizing that this strategy had been solidified long before the packet arrived at their doorstep. He maintained that his intent was administrative clarity rather than public degradation, though the line between the two felt devastatingly thin. Meanwhile, Camilla analyzed her own copy in total isolation at Clarence's house. After enduring decades of public scrutiny, isolation, and eventual integration, she believed her position alongside Charles was unassailable. This text jeopardized far more than her rank. It threatened to invalidate the purpose she had assigned to every painful trial she had faced over the years. Reaching the clause detailing her exclusion, she pushed herself back from her desk so violently that her chair collided with the wall. Her personal secretary rushed in, but the queen consort folded the papers away and commanded him to leave without offering a single word of explanation. Once alone again, Camilla unfolded the pages. Adjoining the secure addendum, she spotted a handwritten note emphasizing the necessity of actions after Windsor. Her countenance altered instantly. Recognizing those words as a direct reference to a private clash the palace had actively concealed, she understood that this decree was the result of a calculated consequence. The explicit mention of the aftermath at Windsor traced back to a raw confrontation that transformed years of quiet tension into a constitutional emergency Charles could no longer overlook. The instrument had not materialized out of thin air. Its true genesis occurred within the walls of Windsor Castle during a state gathering meant to exhibit royal solidarity. Behind closed doors, a debate concerning Catherine's forthcoming responsibilities escalated into a far more dangerous crisis. A direct defiance of William's position and Charles's lineage arrangements, a single declaration uttered away from the media altered the dynamic entirely. Witnesses would subsequently identify that precise moment as the threshold where Charles understood that personal sentiment could no longer override the needs of the throne. Friction had been intensifying for numerous months. Camilla anticipated that her immediate staff, trusted strategists, and personal choices for state ritual would retain prominent influence even after William eventually claimed the crown. The prince, however, envisioned a vastly different trajectory. A streamlined royal house with centralized control, fewer dissenting opinions, and absolute authority resting with his immediate household. This operational transition, the orchestrated passing of state duties from one monarchical era to the next, was vital because institutional ambiguity threatened to split staff devotions and diminish public trust before the incoming king could even take charge. Simultaneously, Catherine had taken an active role in high-level strategies regarding societal trust, youth development, charity modernization, and royal public relations. Her expanding portfolio was far from mere public window dressing. The king leaned heavily on her unique capability to resonate with younger generations and anchor the monarchy during volatile periods. Camilla viewed this access with growing apprehension, fearing the palace was covertly establishing a secondary court around the Wales family, an independent network of advisors capable of eclipsing her influence while she still reigned beside the king. The breaking point arrived during a strategic planning session for the Windsor Commonwealth reception. The meeting had been organized to coordinate a prominent diplomatic event featuring delegates from across the Commonwealth, the voluntary alliance of independent nations bound by historical ties. Catherine was designated to lead the Future Strategy Working Group, an assignment the Queen Consort actively opposed. In the direct presence of both Charles and William, she delivered the ultimatum that reshaped their entire dynamic, stating that two queens could not pilot the family simultaneously while she remained in her position. Choosing not to engage in an argument, Catherine secured her briefing folder, looked directly at the sovereign, and inquired if her very participation had become a liability. Charles paused. His brief hesitation lasted only a few heartbeats, yet it carried the impact of a physical blow. Though she maintained her composure, the emotional wound was undeniable, as the path she had embraced purely out of duty was suddenly reframed as an act of personal self-interest. William pushed back from the table and firmly informed Camilla that Catherine's future status was not hers to limit. The king signaled for order, but the prince remained standing, refusing to sit until his wife's rightful place was validated. Catherine reiterated her desire to avoid internal strife, Yet William maintained that the issue had already bypassed personal sentiments. Once Catherine exited the room, Camilla pressed Charles to halt the transfer of institutional portfolios to the Wales household. During the recorded session, she cautioned that William was moving with reckless speed and that his wife's immense public favor risked eclipsing the monarch before his own era could fully establish itself. The king offered little response, but later that night, he summoned the restricted lineage archives and inscribed across the Windsor Protocol record that continuity demands absolute clarity. Within 48 hours, legal experts were directed to draft the instrument that would remove her from the future fabric of the monarchy. Nevertheless, upon realizing that her single passionate outburst at Windsor had served as the catalyst for her displacement, Camilla refused to accept the decree without confronting Charles directly. Dispensing with strategists, family outreach, or court staff directives, she marched the folded document straight to Charles and closed the library doors firmly behind her. No assistant stayed behind, and no royal courtiers were present to soften the rhetoric. For the first time since the document had been signed, the sovereign and his partner stood eye to eye with unvarnished reality between them. Slamming the papers onto the desk, Camilla posed the question Charles had most desperately avoided. Had he acted to preserve the crown? Or had he simply chosen Catherine over her? Charles had dismissed his personal attendance hours earlier and was reviewing state dispatches within the private library at Clarence House. The executed document rested exposed between them, its broken wax seal serving as undeniable proof that the choice could no longer be masked by administrative protocols. While a royal consort serves as the legal partner of a ruling sovereign, the title offers no inherent authority once that specific reign reaches its end. Camilla comprehended this legal reality entirely. The text did not strip her of her current status as the king's partner. Instead, it decreed that her institutional power would terminate precisely when his reign ended, ensuring she would hold no verified influence within William's upcoming court. Dropping the text back onto the table, Camilla accused the king of permitting William and Catherine to dictate her historical legacy. She demanded to know if decades of loyalty by his side could truly be invalidated by a single dispute at Windsor. Charles stood up unhurriedly, keeping his tone entirely level. He informed her that the ultimate responsibility for the choice rested entirely on his shoulders. No external expert had mandated his action, and no constitutional decree had forced this specific path. The crown, he argued, could not transition into a new era burdened by clashing courts, fractured loyalties, and an unresolved feud over Catherine's position. The queen consort looked at him with an entirely new expression. She had anticipated that he would shift blame onto palace officials, statutory warnings, or direct demands from the prince. Instead, the king accepted total ownership of the mandate. This direct accountability struck her more profoundly than any defensive excuse, because it meant her partner had evaluated the personal toll and signed the document regardless. Charles then disclosed via a classified court audit that the Windsor incident had been the final tipping point rather than the sole reason. The documented review highlighted administrative staff receiving contradictory commands, advisors sparring for operational control, and individuals within Camilla's immediate network intentionally stalling the reassignment of royal patronages to Catherine. Patronages serve as the official channels through which the royal family anchors charities and public institutions. Controlling them directly dictates both institutional power and public relevance. The sovereign warned that permitting two separate courts to fight over these assignments would fatally undermine William before his reign could even begin. Camilla directly inquired if Catherine had orchestrated her removal. Charles answered instantly, stating she had requested nothing of the sort. Through an officially recorded private meeting, the future queen had actually implored him to prevent unnecessary public distress and safeguard Camilla's personal honor. This revelation stripped the wounded consort of the adversary she desperately wanted to blame. Slowly sliding her wedding band from her finger, Camilla rested it beside the decree. A heavy silence filled the space before she eventually replaced the ring. She then informed Charles that if he had truly sacrificed her future for the sake of the institution, he would have to explain that action to William face to face. Charles had weathered Camilla's fierce resentment, but a more formidable trial awaited him within a secluded study at Windsor, where father and son would determine whether this decree represented structural unity or the ultimate breakdown of generational trust. The confrontation laid bare a stark reality. While Camilla held significant affection, proximity, and emotional leverage, the structural power to mold the monarchy's path had always belonged exclusively to the reigning king. Charles could heed his wife's anxieties, challenge his heir, or delay Catherine's advancement, but he alone held the authority to execute the instrument anchoring the succession architecture. Now, he had to look William in the eye and state exactly why he had wielded that power. This discussion would expose whether the decree was drafted to protect the crown or to assuage a father's inner remorse. Charles waited within his private sitting room at Windsor, the signed protocol resting between two chairs. As monarch, he held total control over court selections, transition blueprints, policy councils, ritual precedents, and the restricted guidance materials prepared for the next king. Ritual precedence functions as the formal framework determining where members of the bloodline stand, sit, and present themselves during state events, acting as an explicit indicator of authority. The Crown Continuity Instrument was explicitly structured to withstand personal emotional pressures. Duplicate copies were held securely by the sovereign's private office. And the Transition Secretariat, the dedicated task force managing an orderly transfer of power between reigns, ensuring that no private family compromise could secretly nullify its terms. Removing his spectacles to rub his eyes, the king mentally practiced his opening statement multiple times before William crossed the threshold. Legal or constitutional resistance caused him far less anxiety than the personal evaluation of his son. The prince took his seat but paid no initial attention to the document. He informed his father that he had never sought to humiliate Camilla. His goal was absolute security for Catherine, not an act of malice against the woman his father loved. The king replied that institutional ambiguity had become the true threat. Every moment of hesitation permitted opposing factions to entrench themselves, staff loyalties to splinter, and Catherine's forthcoming authority to be challenged before she had even taken up her position. William pressed for unvarnished transparency. Charles then disclosed, referencing their recorded private dialogue, that he had widened Catherine's institutional mandates without prior consultation. Metrics tracking public confidence indicated that the population trusted her steady presence. Inner court audits described her as the most resilient bridge connecting historical tradition with younger demographics. Furthermore, Commonwealth consultations, formal dialogues with delegates from the global network of nations linked to the crown simultaneously identified her involvement as vital to the stability of the next reign. The upcoming king had anticipated safeguards for his partner, but he had not expected an administrative mandate this comprehensive. Charles then directed attention to the provisions regarding Camilla. The text fully guaranteed her housing, financial independence, philanthropic endeavors, ceremonial honor, and personal respect for the remainder of her life. She would face no public banishment or erasure from the narrative of his time on the throne. However, those safeguards were strictly separated from any institutional authority, meaning her personal status would be preserved, while her control over court selections and structural strategy was brought to a close. William ultimately picked up the official receipt confirming his review of the instrument. He affixed his signature, but refused to display any sense of triumph. The prince noted that Catherine would bear this as a heavy obligation rather than a personal win, a reprimand the king endured without offering a defense. As his son moved toward the exit, Charles stopped him with a warning. An individual within Camilla's immediate court had duplicated a portion of the text, and palace security feared the page had already migrated beyond royal custody. Turning back, William realized that their internal family battle was about to transform into an immediate public crisis. The royal institution possessed the means to handle internal distress behind fortified walls. However, the moment fragments of the classified decree leaked into media hands, every private grievance was destined to be transformed into a national drama. The initial disclosure consisted of a mere 11 words, yet they were potent enough to destabilize the court. The upcoming queen shall command unshared power following the structural transition. Within minutes, news editors demanded validation. Royal reporters leveraged every insider connection available, and palace staff initiated a sweep to locate the unaccounted copy. The entity that had successfully protected the secret for weeks lost all leverage over the narrative in an instant. On the upper floor, Camilla listened as a broadcast journalist spoke Catherine's name, realizing her private exclusion was actively morphing into public history. A major national news outlet had obtained an image of a single paragraph via an encrypted communication channel set up to conceal the informant's identity. Although the official header of the document had been obscured, the presence of the royal crest, Charles's personal handwritten marks, and the explicit phrasing regarding the future queen rendered any denial entirely useless. Buckingham Palace immediately pivoted to an emergency footing. Public relations officers prepared 3 distinct strategies: issue an outright denial, acknowledge only routine transition mechanics, or validate the document's authenticity, while refusing to clarify its impact on Camilla. Transition mechanics represent the confidential processes utilized to ready state duties and power for the subsequent era. Yet, this disclosure proved that the process had devolved into a direct conflict over who would dictate that future. Camilla sat in isolation as the live media updates unfolded. When the anchor designated Catherine as the absolute future female head of the monarchy, the queen consort reached for the television control but paused. She found herself unable to mute the broadcast because a part of her compelled her to witness how effortlessly the public was embracing the reality. Every spoken sentence converted her inner anxiety into undeniable public certainty. The authority she had spent years cementing was evaporating before a massive audience, and her silence offered no shield. Catherine received word of the crisis while assisting Prince Louis with his academic studies. Her mobile device signaled repeatedly until she stepped out into the corridor to contact William. The young boy glanced toward the exit before refocusing on his books, instinctively sensing a shift in the household dynamic. She informed the prince that she would refuse to let her advancement be framed as a personal triumph over another member of the family. William concurred entirely, but cautioned that once a narrative captures the public imagination, the palace loses all ability to control how citizens distribute their devotion and disapproval. Internal security specialists traced the captured image back to a duplication device utilized by a high-ranking member of Camilla's personal court staff. During an officially recorded internal inquiry, the employee maintained that the copy had been produced solely to obtain confidential legal feedback. However, the timing indicated a far more strategic intent. It appeared highly likely that someone intended for the leak to unnerve Charles, forcing a retreat before the decree could be finalized as unalterable fact. Charles, however, stood firm. When public relations teams presented a drafted denial for his endorsement, the king brushed it away, flatly rejecting a recommendation to cancel the document. He asserted that a retreat would signal that the future of the crown was open to negotiation, thereby inviting every disgruntled faction to challenge William's ultimate standing. His decision extinguished any lingering expectation that the path could be altered. In the wake of the crisis, Catherine initiated an unexpected path, requesting a direct discussion with Camilla completely free of Charles, William, administrative assistants, or legal advisors. Though institutional strategists urged both women to avoid the encounter, the wounded consort agreed to the meeting. While the surrounding palace apparatus shouted conflicting guidance, Catherine and Camilla opted for absolute privacy, arranging a final face-to-face meeting that would decide if the decree would conclude in deep resentment or shared dignity. No court secretaries recorded the dialogue, no partners were present to intervene, and no formal statutory wording could obscure the reality of what transpired. Entering the modest garden room at Clarence House, Catherine found Camilla positioned near an untouched service of tea. For several moments, absolute quiet filled the space. One had been designated as the definitive future of the crown, while the other had been told her role within that future was being dissolved. Yet, the emotional shift occurred not through sharp recrimination, but through Catherine's opening statement, as she assured Camilla that she had not come with the intent to strip anything away from her. Catherine had selected the low-profile setting with deliberate intent. A grand state apartment would have imposed a framework of rank, lineage order, and stark reminders of who was ascending and who was being marginalized. Lineage order represents the structured sequence through which the throne and its state obligations pass to the subsequent sovereign. However, this encounter had evolved far beyond mere regulations. Both women recognized that the decree could not be retracted without critically undermining Charles and leaving William's ultimate authority vulnerable to future disputes. They were not meeting to negotiate power dynamics. They were there to see if they could navigate the fallout without inflicting mutual destruction. Camilla eventually asked if Catherine experienced a sense of relief. She anticipated a guarded response, or perhaps an outright denial. Instead, the future queen offered unvarnished truth, explaining that the text had transformed a distant historical obligation into an inescapable path. It had dropped the entire weight of the upcoming reign squarely onto her shoulders, while binding that elevation directly to Camilla's public displacement. She confessed to feeling profound trepidation rather than a sense of victory. The queen consort watched her intently, realizing that the young woman standing before her did not view this administrative mandate as a personal conquest. Camilla then acknowledged during their private, unchronicled conversation that her bitterness had never stemmed purely from a desire for power. She had envisioned that maintaining an active role beyond Charles's reign would serve as final validation that she had truly been accepted by the institution. Decades of public condemnation had trailed her into every sphere, and future institutional influence felt like the ultimate retort to those who refused to forgive her past. Stripping away that standing triggered her deepest anxiety. That history would ultimately dismantle her life narrative back down to a public scandal once more. Catherine then shared that she had personally petitioned Charles to safeguard Camilla's philanthropic legacy, individual honor, and standing throughout his active reign. Furthermore, she had specifically requested that the court exclude terms like penalty, loss, or banishment from any forthcoming press releases. The future queen required absolute operational boundaries, but she refused to construct them upon a foundation of personal humiliation. Camilla lowered her gaze before offering an honest reflection regarding the incident at Windsor. She admitted that launching a challenge against Catherine in front of William and the assembled staff had breached an unacceptable boundary. While offering no apology for her fear of becoming irrelevant, she expressed regret for forcing another woman to shoulder that anxiety as if it were her own doing. Catherine accepted the admission, refusing to feign that the emotional fallout had simply disappeared. Prior to Catherine's departure, Camilla presented her with a folded, personally penned declaration validating her acceptance of the upcoming transition. She requested that Catherine deliver it directly into Charles's hands before the court issued its announcement to the world. Their private dialogue did not return Camilla's lost authority, but it provided Charles with an essential resolution. The cold decree on its own could never have cleared a path toward announcing the new era without completely shattering the individuals left in its wake. By the time the sun rose, the confidential document was no longer the exclusive property of the court. It had migrated to morning tables, newsrooms, packed walkways, and the consciousness of millions trying to interpret the king's decisive move. Certain segments of the public viewed Catherine's formalized elevation as the dawning of a far more resilient monarchy. Conversely, others interpreted Camilla's displacement as an unyielding, permanent verdict. Yet, a single scene captured outside the gates of Buckingham Palace crystallized the public sentiment far more vividly than any political commentary. Two citizens holding depictions of two separate queens, standing in total silence side by side. Buckingham Palace ultimately delivered the formal declaration the nation had been awaiting. It confirmed that Charles had validated an enduring continuity framework, outlining the precise obligations of the upcoming king and queen consort. A continuity framework represents an official institutional blueprint detailing how state duties, sovereign power, and national leadership will pass into a subsequent era. While the phrasing carefully avoided any explicit mention of displacement, the underlying reality was absolute. Camilla would preserve her personal honor within the current era. However, she would possess no inherent administrative status within William's forthcoming court. The determination was critical because a fractured command structure could weaken the prince before he even claimed the throne, forcing Catherine to initiate her era as queen under a shadow of perpetual challenge. Media analysts designated it as the most definitive operational transition choice since Charles had claimed the crown. Commentators focused heavily on Catherine's greatly increased mandates, the contraction of Camilla's circle of power, and the king's absolute refusal to tolerate overlapping courts. An overlapping court refers to an independent circle of strategists and allegiances functioning at cross purposes with the official royal household. The public was no longer analyzing a private domestic dispute. They were witnessing one historical era explicitly defining the parameters of the next. William followed the broadcast coverage alongside Catherine and their offspring. As the anchor described her as the individual now officially trusted with the crown's next era, she fought to keep her composure. The future queen had dedicated over a decade to readying herself for service, yet she had never wished for that readiness to be broadcast at the cost of another person's emotional pain. The prince silently reached for her hand. His quiet gesture communicated immense pride, deep anxiety, and the shared awareness that their personal existence had just been drawn inexorably closer to the throne itself. Camilla listened in isolation as the palace publicist read a summary of her handwritten acceptance statement. Closing her eyes, she chose not to look away from the broadcast. For the very first time, the queen consort heard her own step back framed not as a capitulation, but as an act of profound devotion to national stability. While the prose could not restore her future institutional standing, it effectively shielded her from being cast as the public antagonist to Catherine's ascent. The London Chronicle highlighted the profound national impact with a sweeping image of Charles's signature directly beneath a headline declaring that the king selects tomorrow, Outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, a crowd assembled beneath a canopy of umbrellas. One citizen displayed Catherine's image, while another held aloft a picture of Camilla. Their shared presence demonstrated that public sentiment can encompass genuine empathy alongside collective anticipation. A news anchor then broadcast a verified passage directly from the framework text, stating that the subsequent era must commence with undivided command, absolute clarity of obligation, and total faith in its queen. Catherine's future authority was now unalterably established. That evening, Charles gathered William, Catherine, and Camilla for one final confidential meeting. The nation had already concluded that the royal house had crossed the threshold into an entirely new epoch, yet, behind the secure palace doors, Charles still had to articulate what his signature required of the three individuals whose lives had been fundamentally altered by his pen. This concluding meeting involved no external strategists, no media cameras, and no unratified documents. Charles sat across from William, Catherine, and Camilla, fully aware that the future stability of the crown had been bought at an extraordinary personal sacrifice. He could not restore Camilla's lost status without instantly reigniting the internal feud. He could not reduce Catherine's expanding mandate without fundamentally crippling the upcoming reign. His only path forward was unvarnished transparency. The restricted document had never been about measuring which individual held more personal value. It was about determining exactly where one historic reign reached its natural conclusion and where the next had to find its origin. Charles informed the gathered family that the Crown Continuity Instrument would remain permanently active. This instrument functioned as the formal statutory text, mapping out how sovereign authority and state obligations would transfer into the subsequent era. Catherine would ascend as queen alongside William, wielding unshared stewardship over the upcoming court's public mission and global strategy.